Good day, folks. This is Joe Rouse. I am the owner and coach here at Breakaway Fitness and Performance, and I wanted to put this video together today not only to inform everybody about the individualized nutrition counseling or coaching that we do, but also just to try to dispel a few myths and to answer a lot of questions that I've received, especially throughout our 6-week Fall Fit Body Challenge that we have going on right now. This presentation primarily is being created to give you all of the basic information that you need in relation to nutrition for fat loss specifically. Pretty much every client is generally training for fat loss that we have walked through these doors. So that's why I wanted to gear this information towards that specifically. So the recommendations that will be made in this presentation are really generalized. Now, we offer more individualized coaching and support for nutrition, and we're going to touch on that briefly towards the end, but I just want to make it known that what we're going to talk about in this presentation would be recommended as a healthy nutritional program for pretty much anybody with a focus on fat loss specifically. First thing we want to start with today is what could be considered the best diet. What diet is best, and what's our approach to nutritional coaching, which we're going to get into a little deeper as we go through this presentation. We have people that come in our doors all the time that want to eat paleo or want to eat gluten-free or maybe cannot eat dairy. There's a lot of different schools of thought when it comes to nutrition and what could be the best diet for individuals in our society as a whole. And the truth is that there's really no such thing as a universal best diet. I can say this positively without a doubt. There's no best diet for everyone. Humans have adapted over time to do very, very well under all sorts of different dietary conditions. That's why we're happy to help people find the best one for them, no matter what their dietary preferences are. Of course, it's really a big win for the clients because you can get in shape doing more of the things you actually like to do, and it's a win for us because we get to help more people. Think about what most of these popular diets actually have in common. And this is the important thing to consider, and some of our reasoning behind not having just one specific approach that we subscribe to. Most popular diets, when done with care, attention, and a little coaching, they help control appetite, improve the quality of food that we're bringing into our bodies. They definitely promote exercise, and most times higher intensity exercise, and raise nutritional awareness simply about what you are bringing into your body. We don't feel that it's necessary or correct in any way to lock into any one philosophy when it comes to nutritional coaching alone. And we've learned this through our mentors as it comes to nutritional counseling, as well as the clients that we've worked with over the last few years that we've been open. We've helped people shed quite a bit of body fat and truly develop a new relationship with food. And we've done it without forcing a specific diet philosophy on them. Vegans can stay vegans, paleos can stay paleo, and we can get success with them regardless of what they would like to eat. We don't want to waste energy bullying people into a particular way of eating. Finally, we take a habit-based coaching approach. We feel that this is better than a diet-based coaching approach, no matter how you look at it. Long-term nutritional habits will trump diet plans and rules always. We prefer something we like to call the nutritional progression model. So the goal with this model is to build habits intelligently and sustainably over time. Maybe you've heard this before, making small changes one at a time and attempting to stick to those changes. We understand that that could be a common recommendation, but one of the reasons it's a common recommendation is because research has shown that it works. And if we've got mountains upon mountains of research showing that something works, we want to consider that as a way to approach something. So once again, we look at a nutritional progression model as opposed to asking people to follow a specific diet, which means doing a full lifestyle overhaul day one, something like that. We call it habit-based coaching. So the best diet to follow actually is the one that's best for you. If you want to follow a paleo diet, we can help you with that. We can help you out if you're a vegan, if you prefer to eat more carbs or less carbs, if you're on a tight budget, or if you only want to eat organic or free-range artisan foods. Really what we'd like you to follow is what we call precision nutrition, and this is the group that we've done our education with and that we are currently going through a mentorship with. We want to listen to your needs. We want to help you accomplish. We want to help you accomplish your goals. We want to understand how you live, what's really important to you, and use that information to help us create the right dietary approach for you, one that's specific to your goals and your lifestyle. Because that's what coaching really is. Diet gurus are in this game to get attention. They want to make a scene, they want to get on TV. That's why they try to force people to follow a strict and largely unnecessary nutritional regimen. They'll demonize some foods while glorifying other foods. Sure, it sells books, gives good TV, but we all know how things turn out when real people try to follow these rules in real life. The best coaches, on the other hand, are actually responsible for, and they're completely accountable to their clients. We get paid to get results. This totally changes the game as it pertains to what you've seen on TV and what you read on the internet most times. That's why we don't really have a specific diet philosophy. Instead, we have a personal coaching process. We'll touch on this process a little bit more later as we get through this presentation, but I want to address some of these things that you may have heard from some of these TV acts or these radio acts or people on the internet that may have led you astray or caused you to demonize certain types of foods. So the first thing we want to consider is whether or not a calorie is just a calorie. So there's several times when we can consider a calorie being more than just a calorie. I mean, honestly, a calorie is just a unit of measurement, but we're going to look at it a little bit differently today. There's a gentleman named Dr. Mark Haub, H-A-U-B. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, but he's a nutrition professor, and he lost 27 pounds on a junk food diet. So what he was trying to prove was that a calorie was just a calorie is a calorie. For example, 100 calories from a candy bar and 100 calories from kale are the same, and that if you eat fewer calories than you use or than you expend, then you'll lose weight. Now, we can't argue point number 2 because it's really a basic law of thermodynamics. But point number 1 is flawed in many ways. So the thing that we want to talk about today, or we're going to give one instance out of many, when a calorie is not just a calorie. So we want to consider the thermal effect of food as it pertains to a calorie. So calories are really just a measure of energy. Our weight can change depending on the balance between two things, energy in versus energy out. Energy out includes obvious things like exercise, right? Physical activity, the energy that we use to stay alive just to sit around, and energy that's added to the body, like amino acids, and like carbohydrates, and like fat. Then there's less obvious things, like energy that's lost when we digest food through that mouth right there. There's also energy that's lost when we defecate, when we use the bathroom. So energy in seems simple. How many calories were in spinach salad, bagel, ice cream sandwich you ate? Turns out energy in is just as complex as energy out, because the energy cost of bringing food in and digesting food. So have you ever wondered why somebody says celery has negative calories and it takes more energy to break down and absorb celery than the actual number of calories celery contains? So eating actually costs us calories, right? It takes calories to chew and swallow, to churn the food up in the stomach and make the acid in the stomach, and then go through the processes of bringing that food through our body and utilizing the things from that food. On average, a person uses about 10% of their daily energy expenditure digesting and absorbing food, but it changes depending on the type of food you eat. Protein takes the most energy to digest, so 20 to 30% of total calories in protein eaten actually go to digesting it. Carbohydrates, about 5 to 10%. Fats, 0 to 3%. So if you eat 100 calories of protein, your body uses 20 to 30 of those calories to digest and absorb it. You'd be left with 70 to 80 net calories. Pure carbohydrate would leave you with a net of 90 to 95 calories. Fat would give you 97 to 100 calories. Maybe a calorie is a calorie doesn't really hold up at all. So to examine this a little bit further, we want to look at a research study that compared bringing in processed food to whole foods. So in this study, we're not just going to look at the macronutrients, so the protein, carbs, and fat content of the food being brought in. the thermal effect. We want to look at the thermal effect of food, so how it heats our body up, because calorie is a measure of heat that we give off when something's happening within our body, a process is going on. We want to look at how different types of food can change the thermal effect on the body. So in this study by Barr and Wright, we looked at the energy expenditure of bringing in a whole food versus a processed food, and how that could affect our daily energy expenditure, or how many calories we burn each day. So they looked at 17 volunteers. Some of them made a whole food meal, some of them made a processed food meal. They were all considered normal weight, and they were right around 25 years old. Half of them were women, half of them were men. Now the meals they used, that they termed whole foods rather loosely, were cheese sandwiches. So both of them were processed to some degree. Essentially, one of the meals that the folks would eat were white bread, cheese sandwiches with processed cheese, and the other one was whole wheat bread with minimal processed ingredients and naturally occurring cheddar cheese, or minimally processed ingredients in there as well. So basically the ingredients list here was much shorter than the ingredients list here. And you can look at comparing the whole food to the processed food in terms of macronutrients and what they gave them, 2 sandwiches at each meal, and what they get from that. So although the researchers call the sandwiches whole food and processed food, both are processed, just to a different degree. But it's a simple way to control what they're bringing in, as opposed to just saying, well, this diet's higher in veggies and this one's higher in carbohydrates, or this one's higher in dairy. Now we're looking at 2 of the exact same foods. One is much more whole than the other, and you can really see that when you compare these nutrient facts lists here. You can't really call either of these whole foods technically, but while the whole food sandwich has fewer unnecessary ingredients than the processed one, the whole food example could certainly be better. But it's kind of hard to fool people about what they're eating in a research study to keep them unbiased. So think about it being an apple versus apple juice. They would kind of have an idea of what was going on in the study. So perhaps this was a really good option, because people didn't really understand which they were getting, whether it was whole food or whether it was considered a processed food. So if you look at these, you can tell there's some pretty significant differences in the whole food and the processed food. Both were eating 2 sandwiches, same number of calories per meal. We get a little bit more fat in the whole food, so with this type of cheese, we get actually more carbohydrates in our processed meal. We get less than 6 grams of dietary fiber. We're getting 12 grams here, which is pretty significant, because that would actually cancel out some of the glycemic load that we would receive from these carbohydrates. So it wouldn't affect our blood sugar as quickly as this version over here would, which we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. Then we've got 16 grams of sugar, 16.5, about the same on both sides. We're getting 40 grams of protein and 30 here. We always like a little bit more protein up to an extent, so that's a big plus here, as is that fiber. Then this is just the weight of the food. So this one weighed a little bit more. So you might think that perhaps this one would fill you up a little bit more. So what do we consider? What did we learn from this study? Right? I haven't even told you yet, so I'll tell you now. This is how they conducted this study. These were their methods. So after not eating for 12 hours, basically overnight, researchers would measure the volunteers' resting metabolic rate in terms of how much oxygen they brought in and they gave off. So they measure certain gas levels to determine how many calories they're burning at rest. Then they're randomly given either a processed food sandwich or a whole food sandwich. And the volunteers' metabolic rate was measured every hour for 6 hours after they ate the sandwich. Then 2 to 6 days later, volunteers came back into the lab and did exactly the same thing, but with the other type of sandwich. So they actually were able to try both types. People tend to think that healthier food tastes worse than less healthy food, but in this study, volunteers rated the whole food sandwiches actually as tasting better than the processed food. And there was really no differences in how energetic they felt after eating the 2 sandwiches, and they felt no differences in fullness. So even though one of them might have weighed a little bit more than the other, they didn't really feel any more full from eating that one. However, and this is the important thing to consider, eating the whole food took 46.8% more energy to digest on average than the processed food. So The thermal effect from this food, the total energy needed to digest and absorb a whole food sandwich was 576 kilojoules, and the total amount needed to digest the processed food sandwich was 310 kilojoules. So it was actually a significant difference between the two. And we saw that the whole foods version had significantly more protein and significantly more fiber, and these tend to play a part. When we're looking at it, we could see that the whole food sandwich had more and more protein, 40 grams, and fiber, 12 grams in the processed food, 30 grams of protein, and less than 6 grams of fiber. And this mostly explains the difference in terms of the thermal effect of these two sandwiches, but not entirely, but it gives us a good idea. So as this nutritional professor said at the beginning that I talked about, he said, you can lose weight eating processed junk food, but he could have eaten a lot more whole food that had more important nutrients outside of just these carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and lost the same amount of weight. If you didn't have enough reasons to avoid processed food when losing weight, add a reduced thermal effect of food to the list. So processed food takes less energy to digest and absorb compared to whole foods. So 100 calories of processed foods ends up being more net calories than 100 calories of whole food. Now, it's not going to be a massive difference, but these small differences and these small changes that one could make, as long as this fits your lifestyle, something that you think you can make, are what will lead to long-term success over time. So if you're trying to lose weight, eating whole foods is a better choice. If you're trying to gain weight, you may find that you need to include a little bit more processed food in terms of actually gaining weight. However, you want to consider the nutrient density of that food outside of just the macronutrients. So you want to think about all the vitamins and minerals you're going to bring in too. So I know that that example wasn't the best in terms of whole food as it compares to processed food, and not knowing didn't really tell us what the difference was. Now we saw that the whole food did have more protein, it did have more fiber, and that it actually took more to break that food down. If you're going to be at the grocery store and considering purchasing something that's more of a whole food or maybe closer to a whole food, these are some of the things you might want to consider right here on this slide. So what's on the ingredient list? Can you recognize the things that are on the ingredient list? That's not always the most important thing, but it can help when we're thinking generally. How many steps did this food take to get to me? Does this food come in a bag, a box, or a can? Ideally, we'd rather it not come in either of those three, because generally that means it's going to have something added to it to preserve it on the shelf, and that means that we've got more of a process in place to create that food. For a real eye-opener, the next time you're at the grocery store, take a look at the ingredients of a few different brands of yogurt. Compare those ingredients. Good quality plain yogurt will have two ingredients, milk and bacteria. Other so-called yogurts will have things like sodium citrate, cornstarch, gelatin, pectin, calcium phosphate, potassium phosphate, and sodium phosphate. Pretty big difference if you think about that. That would be an example of looking at an ingredient list and whether or not you recognize these things. You might also be surprised to see what's in something like cream. Yeah, plain old cream is actually often milk with cheap emulsifiers and sweeteners, such as dextrose. So read the labels when you buy food, and remember that whole food, if we're looking at weight loss and fat loss, whole food is generally going to have more protein and more fiber, which are important for maintaining and building muscle, and fiber, which is important for digestion and important for decreasing your risk for several types of diseases that are very, very common in our society. So consider what's on the ingredient list, can you recognize them, and how many steps did this food take to get to you? Does it come in a bag or a box or a can, or did it grow and was it shipped in, and can you eat it just like it is, maybe after just cleaning it off a little bit? So let's take a minute to review what we've gone over so far before I get into this next topic. I want to make sure we don't jump all over the place with this presentation. What we've looked at so far is how we prefer to address nutrition and individualize it for what's the most appropriate and fitting of one's lifestyle, along with their goals and their values. And we've also talked about the importance of whole foods versus processed foods, and how whole foods can actually lead to more caloric expenditure or more calories being burned just from eating it as compared to processed foods, and how whole foods would generally have a higher amount of protein that we need, and a higher level of fiber, which we need. Both intake of protein and fiber can help control how your body responds to the food you're bringing in. So the examples we used were a whole wheat natural cheese sandwich versus a processed white bleached bread processed cheese sandwich. Both of those had a significant amount of carbohydrates in them. One with a higher level of fiber, which will actually cancel out some of those carbohydrates in terms of how it affects your blood sugar. One of the questions I get a lot is about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have been quite demonized in the fitness industry, in the marketplace, in the internet, everywhere you look. And I've personally advised a lot of people to cut quite a bit of carbohydrates out of their diet. In the past, I've done a video presentation before where we look at the old food guide pyramids, which had a massive base of grains and pasta and bread and other starchy carbohydrates, which really was created to benefit the food industry as a whole. And it recommended entirely too many carbohydrates for an average person that wasn't extremely active or maybe working out on a farm all day and sweating it out. And we're going to get a little bit further into how we recommend most folks eat for fat loss a little bit later in the presentation. But the reason that we now understand we don't need as much carbohydrate intake, at least from certain sources, is because we understand much more about how insulin affects our body and how we can regulate insulin based on a number of different lifestyle choices. Diabetes is the incidence of type 2 diabetes, which is generally completely lifestyle related, is significantly higher now than it was years ago before we even had a food guide pyramid. Not blaming it on the food guide pyramid, but what that did is it affected people's perception on how many carbohydrates we should be bringing in, and it made recommendations for carbohydrates that might affect insulin production or sensitivity to insulin, how we actually use this hormone in a negative way. So let's dive into insulin a little bit. I'm going to try to do this without getting too technical because I don't want to go beyond my scope of practice and pretend like I'm going to talk about something I don't know. So looking at insulin, insulin is a hormone that's secreted by the pancreas, and that's in response to an increase in blood sugar, which is usually following a meal or a snack. Now, you don't have to eat to secrete insulin. In fact, in a healthy person, there should always be at least a low level of insulin being secreted. After a meal, the amount of insulin secreted into the blood increases as blood sugar rises. So when we bring food in, it's broken down, fats and carbohydrates and proteins, and they're all broken down into different ways. Carbohydrates tend to raise our blood sugar the most. They're our most immediate source of energy when we bring it in, and so generally, depending on the type of carbohydrate we bring in, it's going to affect our blood sugar either more significantly or less significantly. And the more significantly our blood sugar is affected, or the higher our level of blood sugar, the more our pancreas is going to be looking to secrete insulin to help lower that level of blood sugar back to a regular, normal operating level. It acts as an anabolic or a storage hormone. So many have actually called insulin an anabolic hormone. When we think anabolic, think steroids or testosterone, things that cause growth. Because once insulin's in the blood, it actually shuttles our blood sugar, which comes from carbohydrates. It shuttles that. It helps to shuttle amino acid and blood fats, or fats that are in our blood at that time, into the cells of the body where we can use them. And many of our cells are actually made of fat, so we need this. If these nutrients are shuttled primarily into muscle cells, then the muscles grow and body fat can be managed. If these nutrients are shuttled primarily into fat cells, then muscle mass might go unchanged and body fat will actually be increased. So if we consider the actions of insulin, right, in seconds, so as soon as it's secreted more, or when it's even just being as a slow drip on a regular basis, it's going to transport sugar or glucose, amino acids, which are what make up our proteins, and potassium into cells that are sensitive to insulin. If we're looking at on the minute-to-minute basis, it's going to stimulate protein synthesis, so it can actually help form new proteins, which can help build muscular tissue, because muscular tissue is built from proteins. It can activate certain enzymes or these things that help us to store blood sugar where it needs to be stored. And when it's stored, it's just called glycogen. That's why we have this written on this slide. It also can inhibit the breakdown of protein. So anytime we exercise, if we don't have enough carbohydrate in our system, there's a chance we might start to break down protein as an energy source, which means we're going to be utilizing our own muscle tissue, which is never a good situation. We never want to use muscle for energy, ever. If we look at hours for insulin, primarily it increases proteins and other enzymes for fat storage. So if we've got constant high levels of insulin, it essentially will put your body into a fat storage mode if the levels of insulin are higher than they should be on a regular basis, meaning that your blood sugar is generally higher than it should be on a regular basis. So why is this important? Why does it even matter? Because the pancreas releases insulin whenever we consume food. In response to insulin, cells will take in sugar from the bloodstream. This ultimately lowers blood sugar levels back to a normal range, like I stated previously. Like all hormones, insulin has important functions in an optimal level. Without enough insulin, you lose all of the anabolic effects. Since there's not enough insulin to transport or store energy and nutrients. Individuals with type 1 diabetes don't actually produce insulin, and if they left untreated, they can die because of this. On the other hand, if blood levels of insulin are always high, we also have trouble. Continual elevation of insulin leads to large amounts of fat gain and increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, this can lead to the development of type 2 diabetes, which I stated earlier is primarily a lifestyle-related disease. And it's usually characterized by a large amount of fat in the midsection of the body, around the middle or the deep abdominal area. Cardiovascular disease, systemic inflammation, so that would be inside your blood vessels, possibly even in joints nowadays. And the poor ability of muscles to store nutrients. So our ability to bring sugar into our muscles so that we can use it for energy and physical activity decreases significantly. And that can lead to actual muscle wasting and the increased storage of fat, as well as things circulating in the blood all the time that we don't necessarily want circulating in the blood. This can lead to insulin resistance, or some might call it metabolic syndrome, which is a step along the road to type 2 diabetes. So, like parents who may eventually tune out a screaming toddler, cells can actually tune out insulin. So if insulin is chronically high, since glucose is then poorly stored, people end up with both high levels of circulating insulin and high levels of circulating glucose. And it's this constant battle back and forth within inside your body. So they usually end up with things like higher levels of triglycerides or fat within the blood, high levels of bad, the LDL cholesterol, and lower levels of the good HDL cholesterol, higher levels of inflammatory markers, so inflammation within our blood, which means we're going to have inflammation systemically throughout the body, and even high blood pressure. Their blood will be full of crud, essentially, and their muscles aren't getting properly nourished, and their body is inflamed. It's the perfect metabolic storm. So what you should know about insulin is, due to its high anabolic power, many overfat or people that have more fat than they should around their midsection want to avoid this insulin release. This is because they want to avoid storing body fat. As we already learned, you cannot avoid insulin in the blood. So you need insulin. The trick is to learn how to balance the good effects of insulin in muscle tissue against the fat storage effects. And this can be done by increasing your insulin sensitivity in the muscles while decreasing insulin sensitivity in the fat cells. Controlling insulin release during the day, so getting on a consistent food schedule, is important for long-term sensitivity. So some things that keep your insulin sensitivity high, which is what we want, because that's going to give us plenty of nutrients for muscle tissue and keep us further from storing more fat than we need, would be strength training 5 days a week. Already having lots of muscle mass helps. Bringing in what's really considered a healthy nutritional intake in general is lots of veggies. When we're bringing in certain starchier carbohydrates, more whole grain foods, like the whole grain cheese sandwich that we mentioned earlier, the whole things, not the processed stuff. Legumes, lean proteins, so nothing too much saturated fat, although saturated fat can be, we do need it slightly, and nuts and seeds. There's also research to support supplements like fish oil and chromium helping with it, and then making sure we're getting enough vitamin D. So getting outside. That's part of the reason we get outside so often here at Breakaway Fitness. Now, things that can lead to a decrease in insulin sensitivity, and then that cycle that I mentioned earlier of not getting enough nutrients to muscular tissue and pushing more nutrients to fat than we need, which could lead to overfatness, would be bringing in highly processed carbohydrates that, remember, we also learned take less energy to break down, and bringing these in too often. Not exercising so that we could at least use what we get from those higher processed carbohydrates. Nicotine can actually lead to a decrease in insulin sensitivity. Not enough vitamin D, not getting enough sleep, and excessive alcohol consumption. So these are all things to consider. This is where you want to be. These are the things that you don't want. So because of this, we adopted the model through precision nutrition of an anytime meal and a post-workout meal. So our anytime meal here on the left would be recommended for anyone who either doesn't exercise, would want to stick to this exclusively, or for those who do exercise, in which case they eat these anytime meals pretty much for every meal outside of the post-exercise period, which we'll have more on in a minute. As you can see, most of the plate is full of nutrient-dense, high-fiber, lower-calorie veggies. Protein's going to help with appetite control, maintaining muscle mass they already have, and optimizing the metabolism. Healthy fats offer a myriad of other benefits, so we definitely want to make sure we include those. The drink of choice is going to be water or tea. We suggest that you, if you're a smaller person, just simply choose a smaller plate. If you're a larger person, then you can choose a larger plate. We highly recommend attempting to put the fork down when you're 80% full, not when your plate is empty. So plate size would technically be irrelevant. We recommend minimizing the starchy carbs until after you exercise, which is when our body uses them most effectively. Remember, I said earlier that carbohydrates, that insulin helps us shuttle proteins where they need to go so that we can build muscular tissue. This effect is amplified post-exercise, which is why we have a separate plate for your post-workout meal that's different, which I'm making my way to. We also, once again, we suggest using whole foods over processed foods with local and organic selections whenever possible. Now, when we look at our post-workout plate, these are recommendations for those who perform intense exercise, and the goal is to eat these types of meals soon after these intense exercise sessions. This plate actually helps us take advantage of the body's metabolic response to exercise. So it actually includes starchy carbohydrates and quite a bit more protein here, which are really great and important to have during times of increased glucose tolerance during the post-exercise period, which would mean that our sensitivity to insulin, as I touched on earlier, is higher. We also advise a higher level of veggies and fruits here, just simply because of the vitamin and minerals that you can get there. We don't have as high of a level recommendation of fat here, because simply a higher fat meal post-workout slows the digestion and the ability to utilize protein and carbohydrates effectively. So most of our dietary fat we want to get during the rest of our meals throughout the day is more of these anytime meals. Keep in mind, we're not suggesting you avoid fat in any way, just minimize it post-workout. Now notice the post-workout portion is slightly higher, as we had a small side dish of starchy carbohydrates on top of the full plate of protein and fruits and veggies. Of course, one, like we said, could use a smaller plate and a larger plate based on body size, but if we're eating the 80% full as we recommended here, then the plate is not as important. In terms of food selection, the post-workout plate is still based on whole, unprocessed foods with local and organic selections whenever possible. Now, we want to point out that this may appear as a low carbohydrate diet, but it's not. It's a controlled carbohydrate diet. I know I mentioned earlier that we don't subscribe to any one specific diet recommendation for everybody. So what we're making here is a very generalized recommendation. We're going to talk about getting more specific with nutritional recommendations in the next few slides and how we offer that here and how we can do that for you. But these would generally work pretty well for most of the population. Once again, it's not a low carbohydrate diet. We would call it more of a controlled carbohydrate approach to nutrition. So
and remember this is specific for fat loss. So clients interested in fat loss should be getting most of their carbohydrates from veggies and fruits, with a small amount of additional carbohydrates from sugary sources during exercise, like actually during your exercise period, and a small amount of starchy sources post-exercise. So it might be lower carbohydrate, but most Americans eat too many carbohydrates as it is. Consuming fewer carbohydrates will take them right into a healthy range. And keep in mind that all food choices are on a spectrum. At one end we have processed sugar. At the other end we have squash, yams, and beets, to name a few. And if someone is consuming high amounts of processed sugars each day and they switch to yams and oats, this is a positive step on the spectrum, even without making adjustments to carbohydrate timing, like post-workout and pre-workout. So as coaches, we consider even just these carb changes when we're working on nutritional coaching with you. So, for example, first we want to swap we would want to swap water or tea for sugary drinks. Then second, look at switching from unprocessed carb-dense foods to more whole and processed foods and so forth. Now, if we've got a client competing in a carbohydrate-dependent sport, or they're highly interested in muscle gain, then they likely should have more carbohydrates than we're recommending here. But once again, as I stated earlier, that would be where we would get more into individualized nutritional programming, and that's what I want to talk about on the next few slides. But before we move on, I just want to give you some examples of what would be considered fiber-rich carbohydrates, which is a good thing that we want to eat often and any time of the day. And these would be things that have a lower glycemic index, so they're not going to give you that large spike in blood sugar and then the concurrent large spike in insulin as a result. So consider most vegetables like broccoli, kale, spinach, carrots, tomatoes, celery, cucumbers, zucchini, beets, bok choy, lettuce, collards, radish, onion, chard, watercress, etc., peas, beans, legumes, and most fruits. Now, the beans, the legumes, and most fruits, they are more carbohydrate dense. So when you're including these in meals, you don't want to necessarily have this much of them. They would be a pretty good choice for here, actually really for here post-workout. In this area here, we would want to consider more things like sprouted or whole grain breads. If you have to have pasta, whole grain pasta, corn would be something here, but there's not much benefit to be had from that. This is where I really like pumpkin or sweet potatoes or yams, quinoa, oats, and long grain brown rice type of stuff. The refined sugary stuff, of course, that we really don't need, that we would only recommend eating occasionally or rarely, and definitely in this post-exercise period would be things like dessert, fruit juice, processed foods, soda, sports drinks, most commercial nutrition bars, dates, figs, raisins, and other dried fruits. A lot of the dried fruits tend to be quite dense in terms of carbohydrates and sugar because of the way they've been processed and the way they've been changed. So one of the things we wanted to address with this presentation is the importance of eating carbohydrates, but eating the right carbohydrates and eating them at the right time. So generally speaking, we want to get the majority of our carbohydrates in terms of fat loss from vegetables and fruits until we're in our post-workout period where we can use some of these more starchy carbohydrates, like the things I listed. The primary reasoning behind this is to try to get consistency with our insulin so that we can utilize insulin for all of its wonderful benefits of muscle building and of regulating blood sugar, as opposed to having large influxes of insulin, becoming less sensitive to insulin, and falling closer towards metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes. So getting more into how we approach nutrition, I discussed how we don't necessarily take an approach that is heavily geared towards one specific thought process or one specific ballpark when it comes to nutrition. We offer individualized nutritional counseling here. Because of the time that this takes, the time that's required, we offer it as a separate service. The next slide I'll have information on how you can pursue that as a service and go further with us in that service. But just to give you a rundown, on how we approach this and the metrics that we use and the things that we use. We consider your current weight, your body weight. Then we consider your current activity level. So whether you really don't exercise, whether you are active, let's say 3 to 4 times a week, or whether you're very active 5 to 7 times a week, then we individualize it further by considering your body type or your somatotype. So that's what you're seeing over here in this picture. And these are 3 pretty broad generalizations. But they're very helpful in determining how much protein, carbohydrate, and other macronutrients that you should be taking in. So we can determine this based on your body type. Now, some individuals, like an elite athlete who select certain sports, can easily be classified into a specific body type. So a marathon runner is easily going to be generally classified as an ectomorph. Competitive bodybuilders are almost always mesomorphs, and heavyweight power lifters are generally endomorphs. Other individuals, more of the clients that we deal with, can be much harder to classify, as they might naturally fall somewhere on these red lines in between here. So it's possible for a client to be a genetic ectomesomorph. It's possible, so think athletic looking yet still on the thin side, especially in the arms and legs. Or you can be a genetic endomesomorph, so heavily muscled yet carrying extra body fat around the midsection. A client's lifestyle can also alter their natural body type to produce one of these hybrids. So for example, you might genetically be over here on the ectomorph side, or maybe even the endomorph side, but you've exercised and eaten well for years now, and you resemble more of a mesomorph. On the other side of the spectrum, you could be an ectomorph or a mesomorph but you have developed poor insulin sensitivity and tolerance to carbohydrates due to years of inactivity and poor food choices. And now you might resemble more of a mix of the primarily endomorph body type. So we can have mixes, we can have easily distinguishable body types as well, but we utilize this information to classify, or as a tool to determine your ideal starting macronutrient intake. So think proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. These are the nutrient percentages that we want to look at primarily when we're looking at individualized nutritional counseling. So if somebody needs to prioritize muscle gain, then we might begin with something closer to ectomorphic recommendations, and then using outcome-based decision-making, we'll adjust the program on a regular basis for continual progress. If we're looking for fat loss, like most of our clients are, then we might start more over here on the endomorphic side in terms of what we recommend for macronutrients, and then with outcome-based decision-making, adjust the program to promote continuous success, like I said earlier, for someone looking for muscle gain. If we got someone who's looking to maximize endurance performance, then we might actually start with recommendations for an ectomorph type body type. So it just gives us a base to go off of and helps us to further individualize your nutritional programming. If somebody wants strength and power and performance, which myself is what I'm always going for, then we might start with more mesomorph recommendations, and then using outcome-based decision making, we will look at what we can change or what we need to tweak for continuous success. So we utilize all of this you see here on this slide to come up with an individualized program for you that is not only practical, but we know that it gets results. It doesn't subscribe to one specific nutritional recommendation, but something that we can suit to your body style, and then develop goals, or excuse me, suit to your lifestyle and your values, and then develop goals based off of the information that we've gathered from some of these things here. And then of course along with it you get continuous support and coaching from us. So we offer nutritional counseling as a separate service. If you're interested in that, you can call this phone number here to speak to me, Coach Joe, directly. You can email us at info@breakawayfitnessnc.com. That will go to my personal email at this point, actually. Or you can copy this link here, and that will take you straight to where you can purchase that ability to work with us for 3 months on nutritional counseling and get a 10% discount on our group fitness training, or I'm sorry, our group personal training that we offer here at Breakaway, which is our main thing that we do. But if you can look at getting both of these, then your chances for success are much, much higher than one by itself. If you're interested in the resources for this presentation, They are all listed right here. You can see most of what we do comes from Precision Nutrition. That's our mentors as far as it pertains to nutritional coaching. And then from this textbook, The Essentials of Sport and Exercise Nutrition, always their most updated version. So if you have any questions at all about nutrition in general, just send an email right here. If you want to find out more, you can send an email here. You can call at this number. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to this presentation. I understand that I've gotten up closer to 45 minutes now, so it's gotten kind of long, but I hope I've been able to help you understand the importance of regulating insulin throughout the day and how bringing in the right types of carbohydrates, looking at whole foods and processed foods, is important no matter what your goals are. And I've given you maybe at least a roadmap to follow if you're not ready to take the steps and utilize what we can do with you and get more personalized nutritional counseling. Thanks again, guys. We'll see you next time.